honestly. When I walked in and saw them on the couch together, my first feeling wasn't rage or devastation. It was relief. Pure, exhausting relief. Like someone had finally given me permission to quit something I'd been doing out of obligation, rather than desire for months. The relationship had been draining me for so long that discovering Orathai with my roommate, Trevor, felt almost like a gift, a get out of jail free card. Evidence that justified what I'd known deep down but hadn't wanted to admit. This wasn't working. It hadn't been working. And now I didn't have to feel guilty about ending it. They'd ended it for me. I'm Eugene Parker, 60 years old, Australian. From Melbourne originally, but I've been working remotely from Bangkok for the past 4 years. Software project manager for a Sydney-based company. Good salary, flexible hours. No reason to be back in Australia, really. The weather's better here. The cost of living's lower. The food's incredible. Life just works better in Bangkok. I'd gotten divorced 7 years ago after 22 years of marriage. No kids. She got the house. I got my freedom and my career. Fair trade as far as I was concerned. I met Orathai at a coffee shop in Sukhumvit in October of last year. She was a student at one of the Bangkok universities, studying English literature, 26 years old. From a middle-class Thai family. Not a bar girl, not looking for a sugar daddy, just a young woman working on her thesis about post-colonial narratives in Southeast Asian fiction. We struck up a conversation about books. She'd been reading something by a Malaysian author I'd heard of. I mentioned I'd been meaning to read it. She offered to lend me her copy. We exchanged line contacts. Within a week, we were having coffee together regularly. The thing about me is I'm naturally trusting. Always have been. See the best in people. Assume good intentions. Give people the benefit of the doubt. My ex-wife used to say I was naive. That people took advantage of my good nature. I always thought she was being cynical. Turns out she might have been right. But at the time, with Orathai, it just felt nice to trust someone, to not be suspicious, to not question everything. After years of a marriage where my wife and I had stopped trusting each other, stopped believing in each other, the simplicity of trusting Orathai felt refreshing. We started dating in December. Nothing serious at first, just dinners after her classes, walks around Lumpini Park, movie nights at my apartment. She was intelligent, curious about the world, easy to talk to. The age gap didn't bother me as much as I thought it might. She seemed mature for 26. I don't know. Still interested in life, I guess. We fit together in an easy way. No drama. No complications. Just two people enjoying each other's company. My roommate Trevor was Australian too. Met him through an expat Facebook group about 2 years earlier. He'd been looking for a place to rent, and I had a spare bedroom in my condo. Made sense to split the rent and utilities. Trevor was 54, worked remotely for a logistics company back in Perth. Divorced, no kids. We weren't best friends or anything, but we got along fine. Had similar schedules, similar routines. We'd have beers together on Friday evenings, watch rugby when it was on, complain about Australian politics from a distance. Standard roommate arrangement. Nothing complicated. I introduced Trevor to Orathai maybe a month into dating her. She'd come over for dinner one evening, and he was home. The three of us ended up watching a movie together. They got along well. She asked him about his work. He asked about her studies. Normal conversation. I thought it was nice, actually. My girlfriend and my roommate being friendly made the living situation easier. No tension, no awkwardness. Just three adults coexisting peacefully in a shared space. Orathai moved in with me in March. It happened gradually. She'd been staying over more nights than not, keeping clothes at my place, showering there before heading to university. Her student apartment was small and far from campus. My place was bigger, more central. When her lease came up for renewal, I suggested she just move in, save the money. She hesitated at first, worried about imposing. I assured her it was fine. I had the space. Trevor didn't mind. He'd said as much. So she moved in, brought her books, her clothes, her little altar for making merit, settled into what had been my office, which I converted into our shared bedroom. The relationship was fine. That's the word. Fine. Not passionate, not all-consuming, just fine. We had sex maybe twice a week. It was okay. Not mind-blowing, not terrible. Just okay. We'd have dinner together most evenings. She'd study, I'd work. We'd watch TV before bed. Everything was pleasant, comfortable, safe. Looking back, that should have told me something. That we were functioning more like roommates than lovers. That there was no real spark, no intensity. Just two people sharing space and occasionally having sex. But I told myself that was mature love. That passion fades. That comfort is what matters long term. All the things you tell yourself to justify settling. Trevor and Orathai spent time together. Of course they did. They lived in the same apartment. It would have been weird if they didn't. She'd make coffee for both of us in the morning. He'd ask her opinion on things. They'd chat in the kitchen while I was on work calls in my room. Sometimes I'd come out of my bedroom after a meeting and they'd be watching something on TV together. Normal roommate stuff. I never thought twice about it. Why would I? I trusted both of them. I was incapable of suspicion. That was my fatal flaw. Not stupidity exactly. Just an absolute inability to imagine people I cared about would betray me. The first sign something was off came in June. Orathai started being less available. She'd have more study groups, more library sessions, more meetings with her thesis advisor. She'd leave the apartment around 10 in the morning and not come back until 6 or 7 in the evening. I'd ask about her day and she'd give vague answers. Tired. Long day, lots of work. I accepted it because I had no reason not to. She was writing a thesis. That's stressful. That takes time. Of course she was busy. Of course she was exhausted. I tried to be supportive. Offered to proofread chapters, she said. Not yet, still drafting. I respected that. Gave her space. Didn't push. Looking back now, I can see how perfectly coordinated it all was. The mornings when she'd leave for the library, and Trevor would suddenly remember he had a client meeting across town. The afternoons when I'd be on conference calls and hear them laughing in the kitchen before one of them would leave. The evenings when she'd text me that she'd be late, and Trevor would message saying he was grabbing dinner with a friend. Every piece fit together if you knew what you were looking for. But I wasn't looking. I was trusting. I was believing the best in both of them. That was my nature. That was my weakness. There was this one afternoon in late June when I finished a call early and came out of my bedroom to find the apartment empty. Both of them gone. No note, no message. When Orathai came back around 5, I asked where she'd been. Library, she said. When Trevor came back around 6, I asked about his day. Meeting ran long, he said. Neither of them looked at each other when I was asking. Neither of them seemed nervous or guilty. They were so comfortable lying, so practiced. I wonder now how many times that happened. How many times they'd been together while I was working in my room 10 meters away, trusting that my girlfriend was at university and my roommate was at his office. Around the same time, I noticed Trevor was also gone more during the day. He'd always worked from home like me. But suddenly he had more in-person meetings, more site visits, more random errands that took hours. I didn't question it. People's work circumstances change. Maybe his company was requiring more face-to-face client meetings. Maybe he was getting busier. It wasn't my business to track his schedule. We were roommates, not spouses. He could come and go as he pleased. I thought nothing of it. I started noticing small things that didn't quite add up. Trevor would know details about Orathai's thesis that I hadn't told him. She'd reference conversations with him that I hadn't been part of. They'd have inside jokes. Small things. Nothing that screamed infidelity. Just familiarity. The kind of familiarity that comes from spending time together. But I explained it away. They lived in the same apartment. Of course they talked. Of course they'd developed some rapport. That was healthy. That was normal. Better than them avoiding each other or creating tension in the shared space. I was happy they got along. It made my life easier. There was one night in early July when I couldn't sleep. Got up around 2 in the morning to get water. Walked past Trevor's room and saw light under his door. Heard voices. Low voices. I stood there for a moment listening. Couldn't make out words, but one voice was definitely female. I assumed he had a woman over. Good for him. He'd been single since I'd known him. Nice that he'd met someone. I went back to bed, thinking nothing of it. Never occurred to me to wonder who the woman was. Never occurred to me that Orathai's side of the bed had been empty when I'd gotten up. Never occurred to me because why would it? Why would my girlfriend be in my roommate's room at 2 in the morning? The thought was so absurd it never even entered my mind. The sex between Orathai and me decreased, from twice a week to once a week, then to once every 2 weeks. She'd say she was too tired, too stressed about her thesis, needed to focus on her work. I understood. I really did. Graduate studies are demanding. I didn't want to add pressure by making demands about our sex life, so I backed off. Figured it would pick back up once her thesis was done. Once the stress eased, I was patient, understanding, all the things a good partner should be, all the things that kept me from seeing what was actually happening. But it bothered me more than I wanted to admit. Not just the lack of sex, but what it represented. The distance, the disconnection. We'd lie in bed at night, inches apart, and it felt like miles. She'd be on her phone, scrolling through Line or Facebook. I'd be reading or watching something on my tablet. No conversation, no intimacy, no connection. Just two people existing in the same physical space while being completely separate. And I'd tell myself this was normal. This was what long-term relationships looked like after the honeymoon phase. Comfort, routine, separate togetherness. But comfortable shouldn't feel lonely. Routine shouldn't feel empty. And I felt both. There were moments when I'd look at her and not recognize the person lying next to me. The woman I'd met in the coffee shop had been engaged, curious, present. The woman in my bed was distant, distracted, absent, even when she was physically there. I'd try to start conversations. How was your day? What are you working on? Did anything interesting happen? And she'd give one-word answers. Fine. Nothing. No. Then go back to her phone. Back to whatever world she was living in that didn't include me. And I'd feel this wave of exhaustion, this deep, bone-tired feeling of trying so hard to connect with someone who'd already disconnected. But I kept trying, kept reaching out, kept believing if I was just patient enough, understanding enough, patient enough, supportive enough, we'd get back to where we were. Never occurred to me that we couldn't get back because she'd moved forward with someone else. In my own apartment, she started keeping her phone with her constantly. In the bathroom when she showered, on the couch next to her while watching TV, on the nightstand charging while she slept, always face down. I noticed but didn't think much of it. Young people are attached to their phones. It's generational. I'd been reading articles about phone addiction, about how millennials and Gen Z can't function without their devices. Figured that's all it was. Just a cultural difference. A generational thing. Nothing suspicious. Just Orathai being young and connected. Didn't mean anything, did it? Except it did mean something. One evening in mid-July, her phone buzzed while she was in the shower. It was on the couch next to me. I glanced at the screen without thinking. Saw a notification. A line message from someone named Trevor with a heart emoji. Just said, "Miss you." I stared at it. Processed it. Trevor. My Trevor? Our Trevor? The roommate Trevor? But he was sitting in his room 20 feet away. Why would he be texting her that he missed her when they lived in the same apartment? When they saw each other every day. I waited for her to come out of the shower. Mentioned casually that her phone had buzzed. Didn't say what I'd seen. Just mentioned it. She grabbed it quickly, too quickly, checked it, said it was nothing. Just a friend. Went to our room. I didn't push. Didn't ask questions. Told myself I was overthinking. Told myself Trevor was a common name. Told myself heart emojis don't mean anything anymore. Young people use them casually. Right? Right. But that night I lay awake thinking about it. Trevor with a heart emoji saying he missed her. And I realized I didn't even know who she texted regularly. Didn't know her friends' names. Didn't know her social circle. She'd tell me she was going out with friends, and I'd just accept it. Never ask names. Never ask details. Never integrated into that part of her life. Because I'd been respectful of her independence. Because I hadn't wanted to be the controlling older boyfriend. Because I'd trusted her. And maybe that trust had been less about believing in her and more about avoiding the exhausting reality of actually paying attention, of actually being involved, of actually doing the work of a relationship instead of just coasting on assumptions. Trevor started being friendlier toward me, more solicitous, asking if I needed anything from the store, offering to pick up dinner, suggesting we watch more movies together, the three of us. At the time, I thought he was just being a good roommate, being considerate, trying to make sure I didn't feel like a third wheel in my own apartment. Now I realize it was guilt. He was being nice because he felt bad about what he was doing, trying to compensate. Make himself feel better about the betrayal by being extra helpful with groceries and dishes. Classic guilt behavior. But I didn't see it, couldn't see it, because I trusted him, believed in his good intentions, took everything at face value. I started feeling tired all the time. Not physically tired, emotionally tired. The relationship with Orathai was taking energy I didn't realize I was expending. constantly being understanding, constantly being patient, constantly accommodating her schedule, her stress, her needs, and getting very little back. The conversations had become surface level. We'd talk about her thesis, my work projects, what to have for dinner. Nothing deeper, nothing meaningful, no real connection, just logistics and pleasantries. I'd go to bed feeling lonely despite sharing a bed. Wake up feeling disconnected despite starting the day next to her. One night in late July, I tried to have a conversation about it, about us, about how I felt like we were drifting apart, about how we never really talked anymore, about how everything felt mechanical and scheduled and exhausting. She got defensive immediately, said I was being demanding, that she was stressed and I wasn't being supportive, that if I really cared about her, I'd understand how hard she was working. I backed down, apologized, said she was right, I was being insensitive, went back to just existing in the relationship without complaint. But something had shifted in me. Some small part of me started wondering if this was sustainable, if this was what I wanted, if we were actually good together or just convenient. Work was suffering too. I'd lose focus during meetings, miss deadlines I'd normally hit easily. My manager back in Sydney noticed, asked if everything was okay. I said yes, just some personal stress, nothing to worry about. But I was worried. I'd built my career on being reliable, being consistent, being good at managing complex projects. And now I was dropping balls left and right, forgetting commitments, losing track of timelines. The relationship was draining me in ways I hadn't acknowledged, taking up mental and emotional bandwidth I needed for my actual job, for my actual life. I started making mistakes, simple things I'd never normally mess up. Sent an email to the wrong client, double booked meetings, missed a critical project milestone. My colleagues were covering for me, making excuses, picking up my slack, and I felt ashamed, embarrassed. This wasn't me. I was the reliable one, the one people counted on, the one who had his act together. But I was falling apart slowly. So slowly, I didn't even notice until I was already deep in the breakdown, already compromised, already running on fumes. There was this one video call in early August where my manager pulled me aside afterward, asked directly if I needed time off, said my performance had been concerning for months, said the company valued me but needed to know if I could get back on track or if I needed support. I told him I'd handle it, told him things would improve, told him it was just a temporary rough patch. And I meant it. I really did believe I could just push through. Just work harder. Just focus more. Never occurred to me that the problem wasn't my work ethic. The problem was that I was in a relationship that was slowly killing me, and I was too exhausted to acknowledge it. Too tired to leave. Too depleted to do anything but keep going through the motions and hope something would change. Something external. Something that would make the decision for me. Something like walking in and finding them together on my couch. In August, Orathai started going out more at night. Girls' nights, she called them. Meeting friends from university. Studying at coffee shops because she couldn't concentrate at home. Coming back at 11 or midnight with vague explanations about where she'd been and who she'd been with. I wanted to believe her. Wanted to trust that she was just socializing. Needed to trust it because the alternative was too exhausting to consider. If I started doubting her, I'd have to investigate. I'd have to confront. I'd have to deal with drama and conflict and all the things I'd come to Thailand to avoid, so I just didn't. Didn't question, didn't push, didn't investigate. Just accepted her explanations and went to bed. Trevor would often be out during Orathai's girls' nights. Said he was meeting friends at a bar, watching sports, just getting out of the apartment for a while. The timing didn't register as suspicious. Bangkok is a city of 8 million people. Just because they were both out at the same time didn't mean they were together. That's what I told myself anyway. That's what I needed to believe to maintain the peace, to avoid the exhausting reality of confronting uncomfortable truths. So I'd sit in the empty apartment, trying to work or watch TV, telling myself everything was fine. Everything was normal. This was just life. One morning in early September, I came into the kitchen for coffee and sensed something off. A tension in the air. Trevor and Orathai were both there but jumped slightly when I entered, like I'd interrupted something. They covered quickly, smiled, said good morning. Started talking about something neutral, the weather or the news, or something forgettable. But the energy was wrong. Too forced, too careful. I noticed but didn't process it. Filed it away in the part of my brain that was accumulating evidence but refusing to examine it. Because examining it would mean dealing with it. And I was so tired. Too tired to deal with anything. Too tired to confront the possibility that my life was not what I thought it was. My sister called from Melbourne around this time. We talked about once a month. She asked how things were going with Orathai. I said fine. She asked if I was happy. I paused. Realized I didn't have a good answer. Was I happy? I wasn't unhappy exactly. Just tired, exhausted, running on empty, going through the motions. My sister said I sounded depressed. I said I wasn't depressed, just busy with work. But after we hung up, I sat with that question. Was I happy? And the answer was no, I wasn't. Hadn't been for months. Maybe since Orathai moved in. Maybe even before that. The relationship had become a source of stress rather than joy. An obligation rather than a pleasure. But I couldn't figure out how to end it without being the bad guy. Without being the old Farang who'd tired of his young Thai girlfriend. Without proving all the stereotypes right. On September 14th, a Tuesday, I had a meeting scheduled for 2 in the afternoon. Client presentation. Important stuff. But the client canceled 30 minutes before. Technical issues on their end. Needed to reschedule. I was actually relieved. Gave me a chance to catch up on other work. Maybe take a break. I'd been pushing hard lately, trying to make up for the summer's poor performance. So, I decided to call it early. Wrap up around 3:30 instead of my usual 5. Treat myself to a quiet afternoon. Maybe take a walk. Clear my head. I finished up the work I was doing, closed my laptop, stretched. Considered whether to tell Orathai and Trevor I was finishing early, but decided not to bother them. Orathai was supposed to be at the university library. Trevor was supposed to be at a client meeting across town. The apartment would be empty. I'd have the place to myself for a few hours. That sounded perfect. I needed space, needed quiet, needed time alone in my own home without accommodating anyone else's needs or schedule. I left my bedroom, walked down the short hallway toward the living room, heard voices. Assumed Trevor had gotten home early too. Maybe his meeting had also canceled. We could have a beer together. Watch something. That actually sounded nice. a rare opportunity to hang out just the two of us, like we used to before Orathai moved in. I rounded the corner into the living room and stopped. Saw them on the couch together. Saw her head on his shoulder. Saw his arm around her. Saw them jump apart when they heard me. Saw their faces go from relaxed to panicked. Saw everything I'd been refusing to see for months. The silence lasted maybe 5 seconds. Felt like an hour. My brain trying to process, trying to find an innocent explanation. Maybe she was upset, and he was comforting her. Maybe they'd both come home early and happened to be watching TV together and got comfortable. Maybe I was misreading the situation. Maybe. All the maybes I'd been using for months to explain away everything that didn't fit. But this time, the maybes didn't work. This time, the truth was too obvious, too undeniable. They'd been together, not just sitting next to each other. Together, the way couples are together. Intimate, familiar, comfortable. Orathai stood up first. Started babbling in broken English about how it wasn't what it looked like. How she'd come home early because she wasn't feeling well, and Trevor had also come home early, and they'd just been watching TV together. Nothing happened. Nothing was going on. I looked at Trevor. He didn't say anything. Just sat there with this guilty expression. This caught kid with cookies. Look. That's when I knew. When I knew, for certain. Because if it had been innocent, he would have laughed it off. Made a joke. Explained easily. But he just sat there looking guilty. Looking sorry. Looking like someone who'd been caught doing exactly what he knew he shouldn't be doing. And here's the thing. I wasn't angry. Wasn't devastated. Wasn't even hurt, really. I was tired. So incredibly tired. And relieved. Because this meant it was over. This meant I didn't have to keep pretending. Didn't have to keep trying. Didn't have to keep being understanding and patient and accommodating with a relationship that was slowly draining the life out of me. They'd given me an out. They'd given me permission to quit. And part of me, the part that had been drowning in exhaustion, was actually grateful. I asked them how long. Orathai tried to deny again. Said there was nothing to tell. Trevor finally spoke. Said since June. 3 months. The whole time I'd been noticing the changes, noticing the distance, noticing all the little signs I'd convinced myself didn't mean anything. They'd been together. While living in my apartment. Under my roof. Sleeping with each other while sleeping next to me. The logistics alone were impressive. The coordination required. The planning. The timing. They'd been working harder at their relationship than Orathai and I had been working at ours. Maybe that was the real betrayal, not the sex or the lying, but the effort they'd been putting into each other, the effort they should have been putting into their actual relationships with me. I asked where. Trevor said various places. His room when I was on work calls. My room when I was at the grocery store. Hotels sometimes. Coffee shops. Parks. Anywhere they could be alone. I asked if other people knew. He said no. They'd been careful. Didn't want anyone finding out. Didn't want me finding out. I asked why they'd done it. Orathai started crying. Said she'd fallen for Trevor. That they'd connected. That it just happened. She hadn't meant to hurt me. Didn't want to hurt me. Just couldn't help how she felt. I almost laughed at that. The casual cruelty of couldn't help how she felt. As if feelings were something that happened to you, rather than something you chose to act on. Trevor at least had the decency to look ashamed. Said he knew it was wrong. Knew he'd betrayed my trust. Knew he'd violated our friendship and the roommate arrangement. Said he'd tried to stop it multiple times, but Orathai kept pursuing him. Orathai immediately objected to that. Said he'd been the one who'd initiated, who'd made the first move, who'd told her I didn't satisfy her the way he could. They started bickering, actually arguing with each other about whose fault it was, about who'd seduced whom, about who bore more responsibility for the betrayal. And I just stood there watching them fight, feeling absolutely nothing but tired relief. These were the people I'd been living with. These were the people I'd trusted. And they were so caught up in their own drama, they couldn't even maintain a united front long enough to properly apologize. I asked them both to leave. Orathai said this was her home too, that she'd been living here for 6 months, that she had rights. I told her no, actually, she didn't. Her name wasn't on the lease. She'd been living here as my guest, as my girlfriend. She wasn't my girlfriend anymore, so she needed to pack her things and go. She could stay with Trevor, or go back to her student apartment, or go to a hotel. I didn't care. Just not here. Not in my space anymore. Trevor started to say something about his portion of the lease, about having paid rent through the end of the month. I cut him off. Told him he could stay the month if he wanted. Or he could leave now, and I'd refund his rent for September. His choice. But after September, he was out. I'd find a new roommate, or live alone. Either way, he was gone. They packed. It took about 2 hours. Orathai was crying, trying to talk to me, trying to explain or apologize or something. I wasn't listening. Was in my room with the door closed, lying on the bed staring at the ceiling, feeling this weird mix of exhaustion and freedom. Trevor knocked once, said he was sorry, said he'd get his remaining stuff later, said he'd wire me his portion of utilities. I told him through the door that he could just leave the keys on the counter. Didn't need to coordinate anything else. Didn't want to see him again. Heard them talking in the hallway. Heard the door close. Heard silence. Got up and checked. They were gone. Keys on the counter like I'd asked. The apartment suddenly quiet and empty, and mine again. I sat on the couch where I'd found them. Tried to feel something. Anger. Betrayal. Heartbreak. But all I felt was tired. Just so tired. And relieved. I didn't have to be in that relationship anymore. Didn't have to pretend it was working. Didn't have to keep trying. They'd done me a favor, really. Given me an exit I couldn't have given myself. Because I would have stayed. Would have kept trying. Would have convinced myself it could work. Would have wasted years in a relationship that was slowly killing me. They'd saved me from myself, from my inability to quit things, from my pathological need to be nice and understanding and accommodating. They'd been cruel, but maybe I'd needed the cruelty. Needed to be pushed out rather than choosing to leave. I called my sister that evening, told her what happened, expected her to be outraged on my behalf, to call Orathai and Trevor terrible names, to say I deserved better. Instead, she was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Are you okay?" I said, "Yes." She said, "No, really, are you okay?" And I realized I was. I was okay. Better than okay. I was free. Free from a relationship that had been exhausting me. Free from trying to make something work that was fundamentally broken. Free from pretending I was happy when I was just tired. My sister said I sounded better than I had in months. Said there was something in my voice that had been missing. Energy, maybe. Life. I realized she was right. The exhaustion that had been weighing on me for months was already lifting. Just from knowing it was over. Just from knowing I didn't have to try anymore. The days after were strange. The apartment was quiet, empty. I had space to think, space to process, space to just exist without accommodating anyone else. I worked better, focused more easily, met deadlines I'd been missing for months. My manager noticed, mentioned in a check-in call that I seemed back to my old self, asked what had changed. I said I'd dealt with the personal issues I'd been navigating. He said he was glad, said he'd been worried, said my performance over the summer had been concerning, but things seemed back on track now. I appreciated that he hadn't pushed earlier, hadn't demanded explanations, just noticed and waited for me to sort it out. Trevor messaged after a few days, asked if he could come by and get the rest of his things. I told him sure, just let me know when. He came by on a Saturday afternoon, was in and out in 30 minutes. Efficient. Didn't try to talk beyond necessary logistics. I appreciated that. Didn't want apologies or explanations or attempts at reconciliation. Just wanted him gone. He took his stuff, returned his building key card, and left. I changed the locks anyway, just to be safe. Just to feel like the space was fully mine again. No traces of him or his key. No possibility of surprise visits. Clean break. Standing in the apartment after he left, I felt the space breathe differently. Lighter. Empty in a good way. Like I'd been carrying extra weight without realizing it, and someone had finally lifted it off. I walked through each room. Living room where I'd found them. Kitchen where they'd made breakfast together while I worked. Bathroom they'd both used. Trevor's empty room. Every space held memories now. Contaminated memories. But also liberation. Because they were just spaces now. Just rooms. No longer shared with people who'd been lying to me every single day. No longer occupied by betrayal I couldn't see. I cleaned obsessively that first week. Scrubbed every surface. Washed all the linens. Moved furniture. Wanted to erase any physical trace of them. Any reminder that they'd been here. Been together. Been laughing at me, probably. I found a hair tie under the couch. Orithise. Threw it away. Found one of Trevor's coffee mugs in the back of the cupboard. Threw it away. Found a book Orithai had been reading on the bookshelf. Threw it away. Purged everything. Created physical distance, since I couldn't create emotional distance yet. That would take time. But the physical purge helped. Made the apartment feel new. Mine. A space I'd reclaimed from their betrayal. Orathai tried to contact me several times. Long messages online about how sorry she was, how she'd made a mistake, how she still cared about me, how she hoped we could talk. I read them but didn't respond. What was there to say? She'd made her choice. I'd made mine. We were done. After a week of silence from me, she stopped messaging. I didn't block her, just didn't respond. Eventually, she got the message. Eventually, she stopped trying. Eventually, it was like she'd never been part of my life at all. Just a 13-month blip that was over now. I found out later, through mutual friends in the expat community, that Orathai and Trevor stayed together for about 2 months. Then she'd left him for someone else, another Australian guy, younger than Trevor, with more money. Trevor had been devastated, apparently. Had complained to people that he'd given up a good living situation and a good friendship for her, and she'd just moved on like he didn't matter. The irony wasn't lost on me. He'd betrayed me for someone who then betrayed him. Karma, maybe. Or just bad judgment on his part. Either way, I felt nothing about it. No schadenfreude. No satisfaction. Just nothing. They weren't my problem anymore. Their relationship drama wasn't my concern. I'd moved on, literally and figuratively. I got a new roommate in November. Canadian guy, works in tech, keeps to himself. We have a good arrangement. Respectful. Appropriate boundaries. He stays in his room. I stay in mine. We chat occasionally in the kitchen, but that's it. No drama. No complications. No betrayals. Just two men living separately under the same roof. Exactly what a roommate situation should be. I'm paying attention to things I didn't pay attention to before. Noticing when boundaries blur. Maintaining appropriate distance. Not assuming trust. Verifying instead. Not letting people get close enough to hurt me the way Trevor and Orathai did. The relief I felt that first day hasn't faded. If anything, it's grown. Every day I wake up and feel lighter, freer, less burdened. The relationship with Orathai had been like carrying a heavy backpack I didn't realize I was carrying. And when it ended, when I got to set it down, I felt the lightness, the ease, the simple joy of not having to accommodate someone else's needs constantly, of not having to be understanding and patient and supportive when I was getting nothing back, of just existing for myself, taking care of myself, focusing on my own life without the constant drain of a failing relationship. I've thought a lot about why I stayed so long. Why I didn't see the signs earlier. Why I accepted the deterioration of the relationship without pushing back. And I think it's because I'm conflict averse. I don't like confrontation. Don't like making people unhappy. Don't like being the bad guy. So I stayed. Kept trying. Kept accommodating. Kept hoping it would get better. Until they forced my hand. Until I had no choice but to leave. And weirdly, that was what I needed. I needed to be forced out. Needed to have the decision made for me. Because I couldn't make it myself. Couldn't quit something that wasn't working. Because quitting felt like failure. Felt like giving up. Felt like admitting I'd made a mistake in starting the relationship in the first place. But I'm learning. Learning that quitting isn't always failure. Sometimes quitting is recognizing reality. Recognizing that something isn't working and having the courage to stop doing it. I spent 13 months in a relationship that was slowly draining me, making me worse at my job, making me worse as a person, making me tired and disconnected and unhappy. And I stayed because I thought that's what good people do. Good people stick things out. Good people don't quit. Good people keep trying even when trying is killing them. But that's not wisdom. That's just stubbornness. That's just fear of being alone, or fear of admitting you were wrong, or fear of other people's judgment. That's not strength. That's weakness disguised as virtue. I'm 60 years old. I don't have time to waste on relationships that don't work. Don't have time to spend years trying to fix something that was broken from the start. Don't have time to be understanding and patient and accommodating with people who are taking advantage of my good nature. I have time for genuine connection, or I have time for being alone. Those are the two acceptable options. Anything in between, anything that's draining or exhausting or one-sided, is just a waste of my remaining years. And I'm done wasting years. My sister asked if I'm dating again. I said no, not ready, not interested, maybe not ever, and I'm okay with that. I don't feel like I'm missing something by being single. I feel like I've gained something. Gained space. Gained energy. gained freedom from having to constantly manage someone else's emotions and needs while neglecting my own. Maybe that makes me selfish. Maybe that makes me a bad partner. But maybe it just makes me honest. Honest about what I can and can't do, what I want and don't want, what I'm willing to sacrifice and what I'm not. If I could tell other men in similar situations anything, it would be this: trust your exhaustion. If a relationship is making you tired all the time, that's not normal. That's not what healthy relationships do. Healthy relationships give you energy, make you better, make you want to show up. If you're constantly making excuses for your partner's behavior, constantly rationalizing away red flags, constantly feeling like you're trying harder than they are, that's not love. That's just you being too nice to quit something that should end. And the longer you stay, the harder it gets to leave. The more invested you become in making it work, even when it clearly isn't working. Pay attention to the signs. When your partner starts spending more time away from you than with you. When conversations become surface level. When sex decreases dramatically. When they're always on their phone. When they're defensive when you ask questions. When you feel lonely despite being in a relationship. These aren't things to rationalize away. These are things to address. And if addressing them doesn't fix them, maybe it's time to quit. Not because you're a quitter, but because you're paying attention to reality. Because you're prioritizing your own well-being over the comfort of staying in something familiar. And if you live with your partner and a roommate, pay attention to that dynamic. Really pay attention. Roommate relationships should be friendly but distant, cordial but boundaried. If your roommate and your partner are spending a lot of time together without you, that's worth noticing. Not automatically suspicious, but worth noticing. Trust but verify. Don't be like me. Don't just assume everyone has good intentions. Don't be so afraid of conflict that you ignore obvious problems until they explode in your face. Because by then, the damage is done. The betrayal is complete. And you're left picking up pieces you didn't even realize were broken. I'm grateful now. Grateful to Trevor and Orathai for showing me what they were before I wasted more time. Grateful for the forced exit from a relationship that was slowly killing me. Grateful for the relief I felt instead of the pain I expected. Grateful for learning that quitting can be healthy, that ending things can be growth, that walking away can be strength. I wouldn't want to go through it again, but I'm glad I went through it once, because it taught me something essential about myself, about my limits, about what I will and won't accept, about the difference between being kind and being a doormat, about the importance of paying attention to my own exhaustion rather than just pushing through. I'm doing well now. Working well. Sleeping well. Living well. The apartment is quiet and clean and mine. No drama. No complications. No betrayals waiting to happen. Just me and a respectful roommate who understands boundaries. Just me and my work and my life. Simple. Peaceful. Sustainable. Everything the relationship with Orathai wasn't. Everything I needed it to be all along, but couldn't admit I needed because admitting it felt like failing. But I'm not failing now. I'm succeeding at being alone, at being okay with it, at recognizing that being alone is infinitely better than being with the wrong person. That's not settling. That's not giving up. That's wisdom. Hard won, painfully learned, but wisdom nonetheless. And for that, despite everything, I'm grateful.